Our next presenter will be James DESAEGHER, who is at Dynafor and also at INRAE.
Yes. So hello everyone, I'm James DESAEGHER. I will present a work I did in postdoc in the INRAE of Toulouse with Aniwa and David Sheren. This is a modeling and simulation work. So it's basically landscape ecology in order to explore how to optimize spatial distribution of mass-free resources to improve crop pollination. So briefly, in the last decade, in order to mitigate negative consequences of wild pollinator declines on crop yields, it is often recommended in agri-environmental schemes to introduce more floral resources such as wildflower strips. So, however, this is frequent to see that implanting additional floral plots, for instance, cultivating higher densities in mass-frame crops or implanting new co-flowering wildflower strips can have both negative and positive effects on pollinator visitations to crops. So as an example, here is a result of a huge work conducted across 6 European countries on the effect of the proportion of different mass-frame crops, including here sunflower, on the density of wild bees in these crop fields. The results showed that an increase in the proportion of mass-frame crops within a radius of 1 kilometer was associated with a reduction in the density of wild bees in these crops. Second example here, it's the authors studied the effects of oilseed rape density within 3 kilometers on bumblebee visits to Phacelia experimental plots. The visitation rates here increased with the proportion of oilseed rape. So, two results. Several factors can explain these contrasted results. Here I summarized some major hypotheses. If we consider an initial agricultural landscape with a flowering crop field in orange here and bee nesting sites in gray, for instance, in semi-natural habitats, bees will commute between the nests and crop fields. If we consider the central foraging model for these bees, the introduction of an additional crop field can divide bees between 2 fields. This is the dilution hypothesis. This can explain the first result I presented. And if we introduce a wildflower strip here in yellow, this can even distract bees from the crop, at least partially. However, an alternative hypothesis is that the establishment of additional floral resource can increase the population of wild pollinators in the surrounding landscape through higher habitat carrying capacity. This counteracts the dilution effect and can explain the second result I presented. So the third factor is of course the distance between the 4 resources in the landscape. Indeed, establishing wildflower strip close to a crop field can modify pollinator behavior by attracting pollinators to these strips, and through a positive spillover effect, increase the visits to the edge of the crop field. So as you can see, this is a complex system because such competition or facilitation caused by adding floral resources are not mutually exclusive. This can vary in time. It can also vary in space. Here, in this work, we focused more on the dependence on space. And precisely here are our questions. First question, how far from existing crop fields should new floral plots be established to enhance crop pollination? Second question, how does the quantity of nesting sites in additional flower plots or near the flower plots can modify the optimal location of new flower plots? So to answer those two questions, we use the modeling approach. I have worked on scenarios involving sunflower. However, I warned you that I'm not a specialist of this crop. I studied sunflower more as an example of mass-free crop, focusing more generally on the distribution of floral resources at the landscape scale. Our study area is in the Vallée Coteaux de Gascogne, near the Toulouse, near a city in France. Especially, we studied 15 circular sectors. The sectors have a radius of 5 kilometers from the yellow points here. And for the simulation, we used an existing model, which is the inverse pollination model. 3 inputs are needed. First of all, a land use map of our study area. We combine actually 3 different spatial data sets. Second, an attribute table where we specified the density of available nests and the quantity of floral resources for each land use categories with values from 0 to 1. And finally, a table of bee parameters. We actually defined a single pollinator category with which we attributed the mean attributes of the species the bee species collected in the study area based on previous studies. And we calculated the average foraging distance of bee species based on the size of those bees, the intertegular distance, based on the Greenleaf paper. The first output of the model is a map of pollinator supply, that is to say the size of the bee populations and their location in the landscape. And then based on this map, the second output is a map of visitation rates to the flower plots, which can be crop fields, flowering crop fields. Concerning the field data, we installed in 2016 colored pen traps on 30 sites, the blue points here. From this field data, based on species occurrence, we estimated the average foraging distance, which is nearly 400 meters, and the total abundance of bees allowed us to validate the other model parameters I presented before associated with each different land use categories. So here you have the simulated data versus the observed data. As you can see, it's a correct relationship, correct for biological data, I should say. And we considered the model as more or less validated. And we designed a simulation experiment then. Here is represented one circular sector. I remind that overall we studied 15 sectors. Within a radius of 2 kilometers, we identified old flower plots in 2016. Over the 15 sectors, there were 368 sunflower fields. These are our target plots, in yellow here represented. We also selected 120 convertible plots per circular sectors, the black lines here. And iteratively, we converted each of the convertible plots according to different scenarios. I will come back to them later. And at each iteration, we ran the model to study the variation of visit to the target fields. So we did it iteratively. And we recorded also the distance between the converted plot and the target plots. As I said, we defined 4 different scenarios, 2 basic ones, more theoretical, in order to understand the independent effect of adding nests and adding flowers. So the nest scenario, where we maximize the availability of nests with an index equal to 1, keeping the amount of flower resources constant, which means identical before and after conversions. And the flower scenario, where we maximize the flower resource, keeping the quantity of nesting resource constant. Then 2 more complex scenarios. The wildflower scenario, where we maximize the flower resource, but specifying only 50%, so 0.5 of index for the nesting resource after conversion. And for the sunflower scenario, it's the same, but we specified less nesting sites with 20%. So these values were assigned according to the initial validated parameters of the model. At each iteration, we run the model to calculate the percentage change in the pollinator visitations to the target plots with this classic formula. Here is a representative example of our results for the nest and flower scenario on one sector. On the x-axis, it's the distance from the converter plot, and y-axis, it's the percentage change in the visits to the target plot. For the nest scenario, the visit is always increasing, so the change is positive. The increase in the quantity of nests increases the size of the populations and decreases with distance. For the flower scenario, the change in visits is negative for distances less than 1 kilometer. We called it competition, and positive above 1 kilometer, which is a facilitation. So the facilitation reaches a maximum and then decreases. We identified the average transition distance between the competition and facilitation, the CF distance in blue, and the maximum facilitation distance, the Fmax distance in red. For the wildflower and sunflower scenarios, the results were qualitatively similar to the flower scenario, but with more variability. Therefore, we also identified the CF and Fmax distance. So let's see now how our results look spatially concerning the flower scenario. Here is a map of the change in the pollinator supply, so the size of the pollinator population on the left, and on the right plot, the change in the visits. In yellow, it's the converted plot. In red, the increase in visits, and blue, a decrease in the visits. For the pollinator supply, there is only an increase, which is explained by the addition of floral resources promoting bee populations. There will be an increase actually in the total quantity of food in the landscape. For the changes in the visits, the introduction of floral patches induce an increase in the competition in the surrounding of the floral plot in a radius of 1 kilometer and nearly 1 kilometer. And then beyond 1 kilometer, we observed an increase in the visits in red. So now a mathematical explanation. The model is based on equations that can be here simplified. For a given pixel, it's the ratio between the supply of bees, so the bees available in the surrounding of the pixel, divided by the demand of bees, which is all the flowers in the surrounding that need bees for pollination. So it can be demonstrated that a visit variation equal to 0 is equivalent to say that the variation of supply equals the variation in the demand. And the following logical corollaries. Indeed, when we introduce a new floral resource, this induces an increase in the supply by a total increase in the food, but also it creates more demand. Here, by calculating the percentage change in the supply and demand with our model as a function of distance to the converted plot, we obtain the first plot on the left. The slope of the change in the demand is steeper than that of the supply. So we understand better that at small distance, there is more a demand higher than the supply, which creates a competition. And conversely, at long distances, the demand is below the supply, creating a surplus of pollinators in the landscape and inducing an increase in the visits that you can see on the right plot for the visits. Now, if we compare different scenarios, if we had the same floral resources, but with increasing quantities of nests, the only change will be the increase in the supply curve in blue, as you can see, and so on. So the CF distance will therefore decrease. The shape of the percentage change in the visits will also change. The extreme, so actually the dilution of pollinator induced by the addition of flowers will be better compensated by the increase in the population when we add nests. So the extreme situation is when we only add nests without adding floral resources. And this is the case for our nest scenario. And we find back the results on the right plot. So now you will better understand this next graph concerning the role of nesting sites on the CF distance, all three scenarios combined. On the x-axis, you have the percentage change in the nesting index, and y-axis, the CF distance on the left plot and Fmax distance on the right plot. For conversions without inducing changes in the quantity of nests, this is the blue points for the flower scenario. The CF distance is nearly between 801 kilometers, and the maximal facilitation is nearly 1.2 kilometers. So here we clearly see that increasing nesting sites decrease competition among floral resources, and thus and therefore the CF and Fmax distance. It's important to remind that our predictions originate from a model, which is not necessarily what happens in nature. Empirical work is needed to confirm our predictions, but the interesting point is of our work is that we highlighted new plausible mathematical hypotheses about the spatial dependence of competition and facilitation induced by introducing new floral plots. These hypotheses can guide future empirical studies in exploring similar questions. Of course, by definition, a model does not account for everything. And as I said in the introduction, we can expect a temporal dependence of competition and facilitation, which can be related to the different flowering phenologies among the floral resources in the landscape. We did not focus on this interesting question, but because our model does not account correctly for temporal complementarity in flower resources. So next, our results highlighted the importance of distancing mass flowering resources to avoid dilution effects of bee visits. But of course, this competition can be avoided by shifting the sowing dates, for example, or using varieties or species mixes with different flowering periods, so that all plots are not flowering exactly at the same time. Another important point is the importance of preserving and improving the nesting sites in areas where there is a high density in mass flowering crops to compensate for pollinated dilution. This reduces the need for distancing the co-flowering resources. Thank you for your attention. If you want more details, you can find here the reference to the original publication. And also, if you want, you have my email address for complementary questions.